Well, good morning, and I'm going to try to not make this exciting for you. So we're not going to be doing a PowerPoint or anything. I'm just going to be talking, and so I really appreciate you being here this morning. And what a nice turnout! You don't know what to expect when you're starting the program. And I saw that all of the advertising for San Jacinto said that it started at 10 o'clock. I says, okay, my lecture's at 10 o'clock, so it's only people who really, really want to be there who are going to be at your lecture. So thank you very much. My job is also sort of to start things off. I'm going to be talking about background. Later today, you'll be hearing about the campaign that actually led up to the battle. Then Andrew Target, who's a friend, it was very tantalizing that he's going to sort of an inside view of the battle. And Carolina Castillo, who was actually, I was on her dissertation committee, so that tells you how long I've been doing this kind of stuff, is going to be talking to you about what happens as a result, the coming of the Republic, and which really changes the way that Texas is organized. But my job is kind of an introductory job, which is usually the case when I speak. When I'm speaking, I'm usually the guy that has, everybody else gets to do about 10 or 15 years. I get to do about 300 or 3,000 because I have to do the background material. You heard earlier that my degree is actually in Latin American history. So that gives you an idea of how I look at Texas. I'm not looking at Texas from east looking west. I'm looking at Texas from south looking north because I'm interested in that part of Texas history when it was part of the Spanish Empire and then it was part of Mexico. And that's kind of the way I frame this talk this morning. How do we understand Texas before the event that you are spending all day commemorating today? That will actually have taken place 188 years ago tomorrow. Once again, here on the anniversary of the Battle of San Jacinto, the 188th. So I hope I'm still around for the 200th. Maybe they'll ask me back, but that's still a bit off. So I'm here to set the general background because people often make the mistake of thinking that the history of events is just the names and the place and that sort of thing, but it isn't. In fact, history is understanding how and why events and people are related. That means that no event, and no, I got into an argument with a daughter of the Republic of Texas once. She's a very nice lady, but she was convinced that history was about the facts. And I said, well, it's not just about the facts. It's about what the facts mean. So there isn't just one way of looking at things because the facts mean different things to different people and at different times. So anyway, unfortunately, historians do not have and cannot use all of the pieces of history, and that's a very important point. And you think about it in your own life. You can't actually remember everything you ever did in your life. And so when you tell other people about your life, you highlight things. You talk about the things that are important to you, but you leave other things out. Otherwise, people would be very, very bored, right? So you only tell about and history works the same way. You're telling a story in which you have to assemble pieces, but those pieces are not the whole of what happened. They are the pieces necessary for you to tell a story. When I taught, I would tell the students that any event or anything you were studying is like that picture of the dogs playing poker. Then you know that it's dogs playing poker because you just have just enough pieces to know that it's dogs that are doing the playing, right? But you don't have all of the pieces, and you certainly don't understand how it is that dogs came to play poker. So we have to make sense of those pieces. we have to find out, we have to think about why the dogs might be playing poker. And that's an extreme example, but it's a way of getting you to understand that history just isn't facts. It's what we do with those facts. And whether the story, the fact-based story that we're telling, makes sense to us in this day and age. And so the way the story of something like San Jacinto was explained 100 years ago, and the way that it's up on the monument outside the walls of this building today, is a little bit different than what you're going to hear from me today. But it reflects the way that I can make sense of that story for a 21st century audience. It's a different audience that was here 100 years ago. It's certainly a much more diverse audience than the one that would have been here 100 years ago. So bear with me. The story of the Texas Revolution and the Battle of San Jacinto are no different. There is a set of facts that no historian can argue with. So for instance, the battle took place on the afternoon of April 21, 1836, between an army of Texas rebels led by Sam Houston and a portion of the Mexican army in Texas led by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Later today, you'll have an opportunity to listen to other historians tell their explanation of the events more immediately surrounding Texas independence and the battle. My role, then, is to give you an idea of how Texas came to that point. In other words, what assembly of pieces makes the most sense to me in explaining the development of Texas up to the time when some Texans decided that their union with Mexico should end. Obviously, I can't take you too far back in the history of Texas to explain how we got to the breaking point in relations between Texas and the rest of Mexico. Otherwise, we'd be here for the next 6 months. And I'd have to give you a test, and you'd have to write papers, and then you get your 3 credits. But we're not going to do that. I have to pick a more immediate starting point. And for me, that's the Mexican War of Independence, which, believe it or not, involved Texas and Tejanos in important ways. Also, I want to make the point that I'll be calling the Hispanic population of Texas Tejanos, which will make it easier to track who's doing what later in my talk. And I also have to make clear that when I talk about Texas, I'm not talking about the state in its present form. The Texas of the 18th century and the early 19th century, and the Texas that was involved in the Revolution, and the Texas up until actually 1848, when the United States defeated Mexico in what's called the Mexican War, or the U.S.-Mexican War, was a very different, a much smaller place than it is today. It didn't include anything below the Nueces River. So everything from Corpus Christi and Laredo down south to Brownsville was part of what is now the state of Tamaulipas. Everything in the El Paso area was part of Chihuahua. Everything that was up in the Texas Panhandle and that whole part of West Texas was part of New Mexico. So it was a much smaller Texas. And if you were to ask the opinions of the indigenous people who still made Texas their home during that period of time, they would say that Texas was even smaller. That Texas was only those parts of the place that were actually controlled either by the Tejanos or the Anglos, and so it was even smaller than the Texas that the Spanish and then the Mexican government claimed. So let's begin by saying that as part of the Spanish Empire, Texas had been nothing more than a buffer zone. Its role in the big scheme of things was to present an obstacle to French, English, and even Indian penetration of the more valuable parts of Mexico, where a substantial portion of the world's silver supply was produced. Mexico is still a very important silver producer. But if you go to places like China, even today, you will find in antique shops and whatnot that they're selling Spanish pesos from Mexico. because a lot of the international trade of the 18th and early 19th century was done in the transfer of silver to Asia in return for goods, and most of that silver was coming from Mexico. So of course the people in that empire that were sent to occupy and hold Texas didn't see things exactly the way their imperial administrators saw them. In asking them to occupy and hold Texas, the Spanish crown was asking people to make permanent homes in what was often a hostile environment. Not only did many of the native peoples of the region object to the Spanish presence, but the weather and the sheer distance from the well-settled parts of Mexico created obstacles to development. And yet, these few settlers and their descendants created bonds to the land. At San Antonio, what is today Goliad, and in East Texas, Tejanos made their homes and cemented their identity. And by the way, one more aside, if you want to visit the first capital of Spanish Texas, you have to go to a state park right outside Robeline, Louisiana. Because until 1819, everything west of the Red River in that area, beginning at a place called Robeline, was Spanish Texas. It was only in the Treaty of 1819 between the United States and Spain that Spain gave up between the Sabine River and the gave up that space. So the first capital of Spanish Texas is a state park in Louisiana, which means they don't keep it open very often. It's not well cared for, but it's right near Natchitoches, Louisiana. And Natchitoches, Louisiana is a wonderful place to go spend a weekend. So if you're from this area and you want to take a nice drive and visit a really quaint little place, Natchitoches. And they didn't pay me to say this, so anyway, still a little help keeping the Indians from destroying their livestock, crops, and even their lives would have been nice. Frustration with the seeming lack of attention from the government, combined with increasing resentment in other parts of Mexico with the Spanish crown's treatment of its American subjects more generally, led Tejanos to participate in the Mexican War of Independence. In fact, there were two outbreaks of rebellion in Texas. The first came in January 1811, when supporters of Father Hidalgo revolt in central Mexico overthrew the royalist governor before supporters of the Spanish government restored royalist rule in March. The second episode began in the summer of 1812, when a supporter of Hidalgo from a town on the Rio Grande, who had gone to the United States to seek help from the United States to invade Texas, invaded the province with a small army made up of American adventurers, Mexican rebels, and some Indian allies. This force, led by Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, was named the Republican Army of the North. It quickly captured Nacogdoches and then marched on La Bahia, today's Goliad, which it also captured without too much of a fight. This rebel army proved way too strong for royalist forces in Texas, and unable to defeated in battle, the royalist governor surrendered San Antonio at the end of March 1813. A few days later, Gutierrez de Lara, a handful of Tejanos, and some of the Anglo-American members of the rebels declared the independence of Mexico and Texas from Spanish rule on April 6. So another Texas Independence Day. So we get March 2nd, we get April 6th, we get July 4th. Texas can celebrate independence pretty much all year long. But this first Texas independence didn't last very long. Between the dead and the fled, Indian raids and banditry, livestock rustling and crop failures, Texas was a mess. Excuse me. A series of interim governors, including Ignacio Perez, the first Texas-born man to hold the post, barely kept things together until 1817, when Antonio Martinez, the last royalist governor, arrived in San Antonio. His extensive correspondence with superiors paint a grisly picture of conditions in the province, made all the worse by a lack of payrolls that led soldiers into theft and smuggling and shortages of food and basic necessities. When he led the people of San Antonio in taking the oath to Mexican independence in the summer of 1821, Martinez and a few other Spaniards made a choice regarding their new nation. When he stepped down as governor and left for Mexico City, Martinez left the province in the hands of men born in Mexico, many of them born in Texas. For the first time, Tejanos are going to be able to run their own affairs. The men, and I do mean men because women were not allowed a role in public life, who began to run Texas after Mexican independence, were a mixed lot. They had been involved in Mexico's rebellion against Spain, some on the rebel side and some on the royalist side, including royalists José Antonio Saucedo and Erasmo Seguin, and insurgents Juan Martín Beramendi and Francisco Ruiz. And all these guys, well, with the exception of Saucedo, are going to be tied to the revolution in one way or another. So Juan Martín Beramendi, his daughter, Ursula, married Jim Bowie. All right, so that's just one connection. Francisco Ruiz, well, you'll hear about him in a minute. We'll talk about him in a minute. Others who had experienced the destruction of the previous decade came of age and took up public affairs, including Erasmo's son Juan Seguin and Ruiz's nephew José Antonio Navarro, another signer of the Declaration of Independence. Even though their politics differed, they had their homeland in common, working together to rebuild what had been lost and bring true progress to Texas would require the energies of as many people as possible. It was time to let bygones be bygones. A good example of, which by the way is a little bit different of what happened in the United States, because the loyalists, the people who had supported the British during the American Revolution, they were essentially kicked out. Some of them had to go to Canada, others went to the Caribbean, some of them went back to England, including Benjamin Franklin's son, right, who had been governor of New Jersey, but his father sort of disowned him and had him locked up for a while. And so the experience of the American Revolution is a little bit different from what happens in Mexico, where there's an effort to sort of reunite the people who had been involved on both sides, who decided to make Mexico home. Anyway, when Governor Martinez had to choose who to send to Louisiana to fetch Moses Austin, bringing him the news that the proposal to settle hundreds of Catholic families in Texas had been approved, he chose Erasmo Seguin, a professed royalist, and Juan Martín Beramendi, who had been on the list of rebels exempted from an amnesty until the Commandant General had pardoned him and his brother. Of course, when they got to Louisiana, they learned that Moses had died, but that his son Stephen was willing to continue with the project. For the Tejanos, Austin and other Anglo-Americans who presented plans to establish settlements and start development projects represented multiple opportunities to turn around the fortunes of their homeland. Erasmo Seguin, after arriving in Mexico City to represent Texas at the Congress that would write the Constitution of 1824, soon discovered that the national government was not going to contribute much, if anything, to the progress of Texas. In fact, poor, isolated, and underpopulated Texas would be much better off joining hands with neighboring Coahuila until it could stand on its own 2 feet. In the meantime, the new settlers needed the political protection of the Tejanos. Often lost in the story of Texas during the Mexican period is the role that Tejanos played in making American colonization, particularly that of Austin's projects, successful. As the chief administrative officer of Texas, José Antonio Saucedo, a former royalist, led Austin through the maze of old Spanish laws and new Mexican legislation that would allow him to found and manage his colony. When Austin arrived in Texas, he did not speak Spanish, and he had only a minimal understanding of the Spanish civil law that was still in force in Mexico. Even as he worked hard to learn Spanish and understand the legal system, Austin had to be guided by Saucedo and entrust the success of his project to Seguin in Mexico City. An old-time resident, the Baron of Bastrop, who had been living in San Antonio since 1805. And I'll say one more thing about Erasmo, and that was that when Stephen F. Austin brought his brother, commonly called Brown, his name was James, but he was called Brown Austin, when he brought him to Texas to join him, he sent him to the Seguin household to learn Spanish. So there's an intimate tie between Austin and some of the and Green DeWitt and some of the other early empresarios, these land agents who are coming to colonize, and Tejanos who want to make this a partnership. There were, of course, differences between the incoming settlers from the United States and the Tejanos. The Tejanos' Catholic practice of Christianity seemed superstitious and servile to the Anglo-Americans, many of whom had said that they were Christian to get around the prohibition on Protestants getting land, but continued to identify as Protestants. And you even see Austin having to tell his colonists that be careful about admitting ministers and be careful about saying too much about being Protestant because you are in a Catholic country. So even you see it in Austin's correspondence, that the religious issue is creating some tension. The Tejanos appeared to show little regard for race. They detested the independent Indians who pillaged and plundered, but they did not hate Indians per se. There were a few domestic slaves among the Tejanos, but by and large the Afro-Mexican population was made up of free people who, at least on the frontier, enjoyed the same opportunities as the Creoles and Spaniards who had run things in the past. In fact, Tejano society seemed to consist of a broad palette of hues, and even many who thought of themselves as Spanish appeared to the Anglo-Americans, or Texians, as I'll call them in parts of the rest of the paper, as something else when they encountered each other. Texians, on the other hand, had a very clear picture of race and ethnicity and culture. Slavery among the Anglos might consist of some domestic servants, but most of the enslaved worked in the fields. Free blacks were to be tolerated and treated as exceptions because that was the law of the land. But they were to keep their place and remain largely invisible in society. The same went for Indians. There were a few who had abandoned tribal ways and incorporated themselves into white society. But in general, and as a rule, they were to be distrusted and kept out of Anglo settlements, if not chased out beyond the ever-moving line of settlement. And we only have to see the differences between the way Sam Houston thought of the Indians and Lamar, who carries out a campaign to remove them from Texas, to see that, and Lamar's view of Indians pretty much matches the majority of Anglo sentiment toward Indians. And what soon developed as a geographic segregation of the two societies, Tejano Texas, largely confined to the basins of the San Antonio and lower Guadalupe rivers, and Anglo Texas, beginning in the upper Guadalupe and extending to the border with the United States. Left as an island of Mexican life within Anglo Texas was the Tejano community in and around Nacogdoches. The East Texas Tejanos had always been a bit different from their San Antonio and Goliad brethren because of their extensive contacts with Louisiana, both before and after the 1803 purchase by the United States. But even they would come to show their differences with their Anglo neighbors when the revolt began. In general, while Tejanos tried to use Anglo-American settlement as a vehicle to bring about the region's general development as part of Mexico, Texians increasingly saw themselves as part of the American South, an economy based around cotton culture, strengthening economic ties with the United States through New Orleans, and American lawyers without any training in Mexican law setting up shop in Texas, the use of English, not just at home or for business, but to conduct public business, and except where paperwork was necessary, nobody spoke Spanish east of the DeWitt colony. All contributed to the development of two Texases. A government inspector in the 1830s commented that at one point that the Anglo-Americans carried around a copy of the U.S. Constitution in their back pockets as if it was the law of the land. These developments did not happen overnight, and they were not surprising to leading Tejanos, most of whom chose to support the projects of the Texians, particularly Austin, because of their belief in the benefits to all Texas. For one thing, the undersized and underarmed Tejano population was eager to gain support in their struggle against the various independent Texas Indian groups that harassed Tejano settlements and ranches and had done it for 100 years. Their entreaties to the government for more troops, the construction of new forts, and the promotion of migration from the interior of Mexico had not been successful. Too caught up in the political intriguing between those who wanted a strong national government and those who wanted strong state governments, and unable to gain control over the nation's finances because of corruption and a bloated military establishment, the resources that Tejanos repeatedly called for did not come. The result was that Texas increasingly drifted away from both its state partner of Coahuila and the national government. When the national government finally took notice of what was happening in Texas as a result of General Mieri Terán's inspection of the border region, the situation had grown beyond control. Many historians see the national law of April 6, 1830 as a turning point in the relations between Texas and the rest of Mexico. And with good reason. In the law, the government in Mexico City, now in the hands of those who wanted to concentrate power in the nation's capital, wanted to put the brakes on immigration from the United States and foster migration from the Mexican interior, turn Texas's economy in the direction of the rest of Mexico, begin enforcing the collection of tariffs on goods coming into the Texian settlement, and the introduction of slaves, and establish strong military presence to both stop Indian raids and force compliance with Mexican law. The surprising thing is that most of these actions had been on the Tejanos' wish list from the earliest days of independence. Tejanos actually wanted an increased military presence since it meant more protection from Indians and larger payrolls to be spent on the agricultural goods and services that Tejanos provided. Tejanos wanted better integration of the Texas economy with the rest of Mexico, particularly through the opening of a port on the Texas Gulf Coast that could supply the country's north. Tejanos wanted more Mexicans to move to and settle in Texas. But the law of April 6, 1830 landed like a lead balloon, or should I say a bomb, in the Texian community. Texians, as recent arrivals who called their settlements colonies and were referred to as colonists, increasingly identified with the United States colonial experience. And naturally, they saw the government in Mexico City as alien, corrupt, and coercive. Bringing government troops into Texas was like redcoats occupying Boston. Collecting tariffs was like taxation without representation. Although the tariffs in question had all been legislated a decade earlier, and the only thing the government was now doing was trying to enforce those tariffs. Stopping immigration was denying people their freedom of movement. And to make matters worse, the prohibition on the introduction of enslaved people was denying Texans economic opportunity. Hadn't the British government offered freedom to enslaved Africans who took up arms against the American revolutionaries? It did not help that Mexico and even the state of which Texas was part suffered from chronic political instability. Tejanos, who had struggled through the divisions between royalists and insurgents and who had experienced the political turmoil of the early 1820s, saw the inability of Mexicans to settle on a form of government as regrettable but manageable. For Anglo-Texans, the periodic revolts, the overthrows of national administrations, and the infighting in the state capital in Saltillo all represented an unacceptable situation that opened the door to tyranny. We can see how different the Tejanos and the Texian cultures were in the fact that Tejanos refused to attend political conventions that Texians organized in fall 1832 and spring 1833 to demand reforms and advocate for a separation of Texas from Coahuila. I'm getting close to the end, folks. Hang in there. And I'd like to end by focusing on why Texians increasingly found their relationship with Coahuila as untenable and destructive of their interests. Just like the national government, the state government suffered from infighting between factions, one of which centered on Saltillo, and the others represented the interests of the rest of the state. One thing the politicians in Coahuila could agree on was that slavery had to come to an end. The state constitution of 1827 had already declared that no one was born enslaved in Coahuila y Tejas, and the legislature could be counted on to find other ways of undermining slavery. The politicians of Coahuila had also taken advantage of the vast public domain of Texas to reward themselves, their friends, and make money. Their efforts to establish a functional court system in Texas had only produced a seemingly corrupt circuit judge, Thomas Jefferson Chambers, who, by the way, somehow still managed to get a county named for him, just north of here. There's a Chambers County that's named for Thomas Jefferson Chambers. I wouldn't have given that guy, anyway, shoe shine. And so, despite belated efforts, there's a great story, that's another time. See, there's all these stories that I cannot include in what I'm talking about this morning. But it's get into Texas history, and it's just amazing what you'll find. There are, and mostly these characters, they put to shame anybody who gets accused of embezzlement or fraud or government corruption these days. They were very colorful. And so despite the belated efforts on the part of both the national and state governments to meet some of the demands of the Texians, and they tried. For instance, trial by jury was instituted, accepting English as in legal matters, the resumption of immigration from the United States. Relations between Texians and the rest of Mexico did not materially improve. When the national government, now in the hands of those who wanted a strong, centralized national administration, sent General Filisola with a regiment of regulars to Texas with orders to round up some of the perceived troublemakers, those who sought a complete break with Mexico found an opportunity. Other Texans, including many in the Tejano leadership, saw the revolt as directed at restoring the federal Constitution of 1824 and a chance to make Texas a separate state from Coahuila. As the fighting intensified in fall of 1835, Tejanos lent their support to the revolt. And when the provisional government called for a new convention at what is now Washington on the Brazos, San Antonio's Tejanos sent two delegates, Francisco Ruiz and Jose Antonio Navarro, who on March 2nd, 1836, decided for independence. On the battlefield, Juan Seguin, Plácido Benavides, and their followers had already begun contributing to the revolt. Others, such as Carlos de la Garza and his followers, had chosen to remain loyal to Mexico. So when word of independence arrived, Tejanos had choices to make about who to support. Just as they had 20 years earlier, many chose rebellion, while some chose loyalty to the government. But that was also the case among the Texians, a significant number of whom decided to stay out of the fight. partially out of self-interest. Many of them were receiving land from the government, and they feared that the revolt might lead to their efforts to get land would not happen. So they were known as Tories, as a matter of fact, because they supported the Mexican government during the revolution. So it isn't as clear-cut as it's often dependent. There were people on both sides who actually did not sympathize with their respective, supposedly, their respective causes. The course of the war before Santa Anna's pursuit of Sam Houston and their historic encounter here 188 years ago is beyond what we have time for. I will say that the character of the conflict changed as more and more volunteers arrived from the United States, and that Tejanos had a role to play in all of the famous events involved with the conflict, even the runaway scrape. And often we don't acknowledge the fact that there were a number of Tejano families, including the Seguin family, that actually participated in the runaway scrape. That their participation in the development of Texas during the Mexican period and the revolt that ended Mexican rule has long been neglected or minimized is a function of how Tejanos were perceived by Anglo-Texans. As that perception changes, recent historians have had an opportunity to discover and employ pieces of the puzzle long ignored to reframe the story of the Texas Revolution and the Battle of San Jacinto in a more complete and honest way. And yet, there is much more to be done, and I'm grateful for you being here this morning and listening to the efforts of some of us in that direction. Thank you very much.